Welcome to yet another interesting webinar from Document 360. We are waiting for more people to join. We had a very good number of registrations today, and I can see people joining one after the other. My name is Kunal. I am from the team Document 360 and one of the co-organizers of this session. As I told you earlier, the topic for the day is how to write inclusive documentation. And we have a very interesting speaker, Jessica. She is from Zapier. She's a senior technical writer at Zapier. She has been specializing in technical writing for the last few years. Apparently, she was the first technical writer ever at Zapier, and she has built the team within the company over the last couple of years. So she will today talk to us about why inclusive language matters in your documentation and how it makes your content more accessible to the wider audience. I now invite Jessica to take over from here and share your thoughts with us over the next few minutes. Thank you again. We wish you all a wonderful time of learning. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much for that lovely intro, and thank you everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on how to write inclusive documentation. So we've already had a little quick intro to me, but my name is Jess, or Jessica Valerio Hill. As mentioned, I'm the senior technical writer at Zapier, and I've been at Zapier for the past 6 years, specializing in technical writing for the last 4. And if you're not familiar with Zapier, it's a work productivity tool that automates time-consuming tasks into your favorite apps. So again, thank you so much for tuning in, and let's kick on with today's agenda. So we've got roughly an hour together today, so we've got lots to get through, but here's a quick overview as to what the agenda will be. So I'll be kicking off with what the definition of inclusive documentation is, and then I'll go over why accessibility is important, and then I'll dive into some tips on how to apply inclusive language into your documentation, and then I'll walk through a case study about identifying inclusive language, and then we'll talk over some of the most common web content accessibility issues, and then we'll have some final thoughts, and then hopefully we'll have around 20 to 30 minutes at the end for the Q&A. So hopefully that sounds good for everyone, and I'll kick things off. So what is inclusive documentation? I think Google does a really great job of kind of defining what this is. So Google defines inclusiveness as the practice and policy of including people who might be otherwise excluded or marginalized. It's a part of accessibility. Language is inclusive when it doesn't exclude anyone based on characteristics such as gender, physical or mental disability, or cultural background. And every human is treated with dignity and respect. Showing empathy in your documentation unlocks the potential of being fair and equal to all. And being inclusive should be a guiding principle for documentation frameworks, and content writers need to practice in producing bias-free inclusive content. So that was a quote from Google, and really with inclusive language, it isn't limited to documentation by any means, but using inclusive language can be applied to all areas of communication, whether it's written or verbal. But for this talk, we'll focus on how to use inclusive language along with some accessibility best practices in your documentation today. So let's get into why accessibility is important. So according to the World Health Organization, in 2022, it's estimated that 1.3 billion people experience significant disability, and that means 1 in 6 people in the world have a disability. So when we think about that, I want to kind of sidestep and touch upon the subject of permanent, temporary, and situational impairments. As often when we talk about accessibility, there can be this perception that when we think about accessibility, it only applies to, a certain image that we may have around a person with a permanent impairment, but really all users have different needs at different times and in different circumstances. So throughout their life, they may experience either permanent, temporary, or situational impairments. So let's kind of go with the example of, let's take the example that someone's trying to access some content that you work on. So this could be affected by the user's, say, location. Maybe they are on a busy train, maybe they're sitting outside in the sun, or maybe they're in a coffee shop with like slow access to Wi-Fi. Or potentially the user's health may be affecting how they're viewing your content. Potentially maybe the user is tired, or maybe they're recovering from a broken arm, or maybe the equipment is affecting them. So maybe they're accessing your content via mobile, or maybe they're using an older browser. So those are just an example of some temporary or situational impairments. And I'll show you some more on the screen now. But I think it's important to remember that, it isn't always permanent impairments we need to think about, but sometimes there may be, situational or temporary impairments that can make it more difficult for someone to understand your content. And I do want to stress that not one type of impairment outweighs the other. They are all equally important, but I really want to call out that all people have the potential to have an accessibility need at one point in their life, whether it's permanent, temporary, or situational impairment. And by having accessibility at the forefront of when you're designing and writing your content, it really helps to ensure that no one is excluded. So let's let's talk about some tips on how to apply inclusive documentation to any of your existing style guidelines and some best practices. Just want to note some of these tips I'm going to walk through aren't necessarily limited to documentation. They can be applied to other areas of writing and also communication as well. So let's kick off with screenshots. So let's walk through some best practices. So the first one is add alternative text. So alternative text sometimes can be referred to as alt text. You may hear it referred to as that. And it's really important because users who have visual disabilities rely on screen readers to actually encode words, and they might not be able to see or interpret visual elements without it. So it's really important that alt text is accurately describes the content and the purpose of the screenshot in the first place. So on the left, you can see an example of, in the green, those are the examples of alt text applied to the screenshots there. And then the next point is when you do use screenshots, make sure they're not a replacement for text. So if there's a piece of information that's really crucial to the user's understanding or ability to do something, ensure that it's clearly written out in text and not just lost within the screenshot. This ensures that readers who cannot see or interpret your screenshot will still have access to the same information. And also, if you're going to be using annotations within your screenshots, use them sparingly as they can't be translated. Another thing to avoid with screenshots is if they are text heavy. So if you do need to add in a screenshot and it contains a lot of text in there, consider potentially kind of moving to a more accessible format such as plain text or HTML rather than a screenshot. This again will be easier for screen readers to actually read and pass your content. And then lastly, ensure that there's sufficient contrast. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 state that there needs to be a contrast of at least 4 to 5 to 1. There are a few exceptions which I've listed on the screen, but again, you can use tools such as Wave, which is a Chrome extension that you can use on your content to see whether your screenshots kind of meet that ratio, just to help our users. And then next, let's move on to things to avoid. So I've grouped here things to avoid being idioms, slang, and cultural references. So for us at Zapier, we have users that come from multiple different countries and cultural backgrounds, and English may not always be their first language. So let's talk a bit about idioms. So again, why we should be avoiding them. So idioms are phrases or expressions that typically present a figurative or non-literal meaning attached to a phrase. And sometimes when they are translated, they may not necessarily have the desired meaning. So think of common ones maybe such as hang in there or heads up. They might be confusing to a non-native speaker of English. So instead, focus on writing with a universal language and making sure your content can be understood at your widest audience. And again, similar with slang, not all slang is universal. Sometimes words can carry different meaning in other countries and cultures. So kind of be mindful when you are using that in your content. Another one is avoiding cultural references. Again, it's important to use plain language or phrases. I'm going to draw on my own experiences of seeing cultural references within documentation. A couple of weeks ago, I was looking through some developer documentation and there were several references around Star Wars throughout the guides. So in my personal experience, whilst I'm aware of the movie, the franchise, and I have some idea of the characters, a lot of the references were lost on me because I didn't understand the significance of the reference there. And whilst it may be great for a certain subset of users who, really enjoy the Star Wars franchise, not everyone will have that same context. So in my instance, all of those were lost on me, and it actually deterred me from kind of reading the content any further. So again, there's always kind of caveats depending on your audience and who you're writing to, but there may be some cases where it's more acceptable to use idioms, slangs, and cultural references in more targeted content with a specific audience in mind. But if you ever have any doubt, just avoid usage altogether. Let's get into some don't use. So we're going to be talking about ableist, biased, and gendered language. So let's talk about ableist language. So ableist language is any word or phrase that devalues people who have a disability. So here's an example on the screen as what that could look like, reasons for why you shouldn't necessarily reference it, an alternative phrase that you can use instead. And I love that on this website that I was looking at, Holistic 𝐭𝐚𝐤𝐬, they actually I love the way that they kind of phrased around why you shouldn't be using ableist language. They made a call out that you aren't necessarily automatically a bad or evil person if maybe you've used some terms like this in the past, but if you do have the cognitive and language privilege to adjust your language, it's really worth considering how to become more aware of how everyday language like this helps perpetuate ableistic and idealist views. And the next, biased language. So biased language is any words or phrases that can make certain people or groups feel excluded or underrepresented. So I'll walk through a couple of examples. So in our first one, we have blacklist and whitelist. So the reason why we should avoid using this is because this is a racial bias used. So really what's happening here is with this language, we're implying that black is bad and white is good, which is not true in the slightest. And instead we should use words such as deny list or allow list to convey our message. And then there's other references here that, biased language isn't just racial, there's other references to mental health and also gender as well. And then next, let's talk about don't use gendered language, which we kind of touched a little bit on in our previous slide. And essentially, gendered language, here's some top tips for how to avoid using it within your content. So the first one would be just to bypass the use of gender where possible. Especially within technical writing, you're often writing procedures and instructional material, so you're more than likely speaking directly to the reader. Another tip as well is to use plural nouns and plural pronouns. Again, avoiding any use of having to insert gendered language where it's not necessary. And again, avoid pronouns where you can completely. And in some instances, it might be easier to actually repeat the noun, and that sometimes can make your writing a bit more clear for what you're doing there. And you can use a and the in those instances too. And then next one is don't assume on your reader's behalf. So I'm going to put some phrases on the screen of things that I've seen in tutorials, and I've also been guilty when I was first learning about technical writing, about adding these to tutorials. So typically when people have the intention of adding words or phrases along those lines, they have the good intention to let the reader know this task is a lot easier than what it seems. But really, how can you really justify and know how simple this will be if you are writing to your widest audience? What may be easy for you might actually be harder for someone else. And you should really avoid kind of using phrases like this because, one, it's unnecessary filler to your sentences, and also simply is very suggestive and actually doesn't provide any clarity for your readers. Along with this, it does have the potential to actually offend the reader. They might feel ashamed or angry after reading your content because you've set the expectation that this is such a super easy task. However, your instructions don't match up to the user's experience. So again, this is why it's just worth just avoiding adding that into your content where possible. And also the reader will determine if your instructions are adequately simple. And here's just an example on Slack's Help Center for a tutorial about editing your profile. So here you can see there's no mention about, it's really easy to edit your profile. Instead, they focused on giving you reasons why you might want to update your profile, told you exactly what you could update and how you could do it. So instead of kind of trying to convince the reader and try and reassure them, kind of focus more on the task at hand of what they're trying to actually do, reading your article. And then date and time. Always spell out the day of the week and month. And I'm going to lean on a personal example here. So as you can see on the screen, we have the date written numerically. And if you haven't already kind of gathered from my accent, I'm English, and in the UK, we format the date as day, month, and year. However, there are other parts of my company where they format the date as month, date, and year. So with that, what date do we have here? Do we have the 3rd of February or do we have the 2nd of March? So when you do use numeric values, you need to be mindful that not all countries follow the same numeric date format. So for me, I know that I've had plenty of confusion trying to read the date, especially in this format, and I always now have to ask for clarity when seeing a date like this. And also it's important to note there may be, readers who have dyscalculia, which is a disability resulting in difficulty learning and understanding numbers. So they might also have trouble understanding the dates and time unless you've specified them clearly. So I'm going to show some examples of how you could write the date if you have to write in your documentation in a much more clear way, so that no one kind of walks away thinking like, are we talking the 3rd of February or are we talking about the 2nd of March? And to talk about time as well, if you ever have to specify a time in your documentation, make sure to specify the time zone to make it really clear. Like, for example, if you're launching a new product, what do you mean by a 9 AM launch? Is it 9 AM EAT time, BAT time, EST? Those are only some of the time zones, but just make it kind of clear from the get-go for your readers so they have a clear expectation. And then next, let's talk about writing for screen readers. So writing for screen readers involves creating content that is accessible and easy to understand for individuals who use screen reader software to access digital content. And screen readers convert text and other on-screen elements into a spoken language or a Braille output. So here are some tips for writing content from the Web Accessibility Initiative. So first one is write clear and concise language. Write in plain language and avoid jargon and complex sentences and unnecessary information where possible. Keep sentences and paragraphs short and to the point. Next one is proper headers. So it's really important for screen readers to understand the structure of content by having the proper headers. So for those of you who don't know, headers help screen readers screen reader users navigate the page and they understand the hierarchy of the information. So how heading tags work is they have a top-down hierarchy from H1 to H6. So H1 being the most important heading and H6 being the least important. And then we kind of touched upon the next one, which is include descriptive alt text for your images. Like I've said before, alt texts need to be accurate to describe the content and the purpose of the image, and really need to avoid kind of phrases like image of or graphic of. Be really specific here. And then next one is label links meaningfully. So ensure that the link text is descriptive and conveys the purpose of the link. So again, you want to avoid very generic terms such as click here or learn more. Instead, use the link text to actually indicate the destination or action. And then next we have use list properly. So when you are presenting a list of items, make sure that your content is using proper HTML list markup to actually convey whether this is an unordered list or an ordered list. Again, this helps screen readers to announce the number of items in the list and makes navigating much easier. Next, we have use a table markup for data tables. I've just also noticed there's a typo on my slide, which is also hilarious to see. Anyway, so use table markup on your tables. And again, just make sure that you're using the correct HTML, again, to help screen readers interpret the structure of the table and provide context to users. Next, you want to indicate language changes. So again, this may vary on your type of content that you use, but if your content includes text in different language, use the lang aptitude to indicate that there's a change in the language, and this will help screen readers to switch the correct pronunciation rules. And then lastly, avoid repetitive content. minimize the use of repetitive content such as lengthy navigation menus on each page, or if repetitive content is necessary, provide a skip link to allow screen readers to allow users to bypass and go to the next content. And yeah, those are those tips there, and then we'll move on to the next slide, which is our case study. So I'm going to be talking to you about the language of health, and this is a case study that was written up by Sarah Wilcox, a content designer at NHS UK. So I'll just fill in the context. NHS stands for the National Health Service. So in the UK, it's our public healthcare, and the task that their team had was on the NHS website, they had the task of picking which health words they were going to use on their website. So they often they offer lots of self-serve solutions on their website, but they have to talk about medical conditions and treatments. And oftentimes they might have to talk about uncomfortable topics too. But they had the task of trying to differentiate which words they were going to use on their website going forward to talk about health. And for when they started their research, they were tested words that got the most complaints from people, and they chose people who had a different level of literacy level. So they had a real understanding from all levels of people, you know, which words resonated most with their users. And they found that people with high literacy level actually found some of their word choices to be simplistic, or patronizing, based on the simple words that they were focusing on, whereas folks who had lower literacy levels actually preferred the simpler words. And also they had feedback from people with a learning disability of dyslexia that they also preferred simple words. And as a result of all of their research, they had over 10,000 participants that they found most people were actually positive with the language that they chose, which was opting for more simple words. And they mentioned that people liked the way that they write, and they said that their language was clear, direct, language was at a level that anyone can understand, and also was pitched at the right level. And what I really liked about this piece of user research is, well, one, that they had quite a unique problem to solve, because not many sectors have the same issue that they do, where if their content is not understood by people on the NHS website, it can actually affect someone's life, and it can be a life or death situation. So really for them trying to figure out what words they needed to use, they really had to they focused based on picking words that were most widely understood by the largest audience, versus going for words that had more of a preference versus what they picked. And then what are some takeaways that we have from this case study that you can use in your work today? So one of them being clarity in writing. Is your writing clear to your audience? The next one is writing directly to your users. One of the tips earlier was kind of, especially for gendered language, was rather than to add that into your content, make sure that you're writing directly towards your user versus kind of trying to personalize and tailor a message to them. And also pick words that are widely understood, and also pitch at the right level. So depending on your audience, you might want to rate your writing against reading levels. For example, for us at Zapier, we aimed at a 7th grade reading level to further accommodate users whose first language may not be English, and you can use tools such as Hemingway Editor to kind of test your reading level and identify other areas of your writing where you could be more clear. And then next, let's talk about the web content accessibility trends for 2022. So WebAIM conducted, they conduct an annual accessibility evaluation of home pages for the top 1 million websites. And what they found is, on average, 5.3 of all homepage elements had detected accessibility issues, meaning users with disabilities could expect to see errors in 1 in every 19 home pages that they interacted with. So I'll kind of dig into the table that's on the screen. So this is the top most common failures that they saw from their investigation. So low contrast would affect users' ability to actually perceive content, missing alternative text for images, Again, we've kind of spoken about how important alternative text is. It's crucial for screen readers, especially if images can't load, and also for search engines as well. Empty links, this refers to when links have no text. So this means that any assistive technology can't actually read it, or it might be inaccessible to people with cognitive disabilities. Missing form input labels. So without these, again, screen readers will have a tough time actually interpreting these and passing this on to the user. Empty buttons, this is where there's missing text on buttons, and this is problematic again for screen readers because this can't convey how the button functions to the user. And then lastly, missing documentation language. So we spoke a bit about this previously, but if there's different languages within one article, it needs to have language aptitude there in HTML to actually tell the screen reader how to correctly interpret and pronounce the text on the page. And if you're interested to understand a little bit more about how your website is performing, you can download the Chrome extension such as Wave to understand how your content today kind of meets against the web content accessibility standards. And then let's wrap up with some final thoughts. So I've said a lot of things. But firstly, inclusive documentation doesn't harm or exclude others. I think this is one of the most significant advantages to actually kind of adopting this approach to your documentation that we've kind of gone over today. And the next one is inclusivity is a guiding framework for writing. So incorporating inclusivity into your writing practices really helps you recognize and address biases in your thought process. As you become more accustomed to writing about specific subjects, it's still important to remain vigilant and maintain empathy for your diverse audience. And by subconsciously kind of challenging your biases, you're actually striving to write to your widest audience possible, and you cultivate an instinct for inclusive communication. And as well as that, inclusive documentation can actually help expand users' comprehension of your product. So by using inclusive language in your documentation, you're really helping to break down, those technical concepts in a much more accessible format to a broader audience. And by prioritizing clarity and simplicity, you're actually enabled more people to understand and benefit from your content to then understand your product or services. And then lastly, keep learning and expect to be challenged. So language is always evolving to reflect society and social norms, and also opinions may vary, and some people may feel more strongly about certain words and phrases than others. And it's important to accept that you may not always agree on everything, but it's also important to remain curious when it comes to inclusivity. And in summary, inclusive language is not only a matter of ethical community. Well, it's not only a matter of ethical communication, but it's also a powerful tool for enhancing the user's experience and fostering a culture of inclusivity within your organization too. And then also I have a list of resources. So I have kind of referenced some multiple things throughout here. So these will be available in the slide.
Thank you, Jessica, for this wonderful presentation. I guess it was the people would have found it definitely very useful. We have another webinar coming up next month. So it is, it's on the topic importance of creating multilingual knowledge base to serve a global audience. The speaker is Christina from, she's the head of marketing from Crowdin. So we'll be sending you information about it pretty shortly. Thank you again, and wish you all a wonderful day ahead. Meet you soon in yet another webinar at Document 360. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Selva. Have a good day. Bye-bye.